Welcome back to the Indivisible Illinois podcast series. I am joined today by Christian Mitchell, the candidate for Lieutenant Governor of Illinois. Christian served 3 terms in the 26th District of the Illinois House of Representatives. He was the first African-American executive director of the Democratic Party of Illinois, deputy governor, and now he's running alongside Governor Pritzker in the 2026 election. Christian, thank you so much for joining me today.
Liz, it's my pleasure. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Can you tell me a little bit about your childhood, growing up in Westchester and Maywood, and how being raised by your mother and your grandparents helped define who you are today?
I was very, very lucky. I had the world's best mom. I actually got to spend time with her yesterday, which was lovely. Single mom. My dad left when I was 6 months old, and my mom and my grandfather really were my heroes. My grandmother lived with us as well until she passed away in '02, but my mom and grandpa really were my anchors. My mom was a NICU nurse, neonatal intensive care, for almost 40 years. 19 of it as a bedside nurse, and another 20 as a nursing manager, and very involved in our church. My grandfather, a Korean War veteran and union steel worker, worked at Reynolds Metal Company not far from the Stevenson Expressway out in the burbs. They were my rocks. My grandfather was my favorite guy in the world. He built a playhouse with his own 2 hands for me and taught me how to cook improvisationally. My mother really instituted my love for science fiction, for football. They were just really wonderful. And so at my house, as far as I was concerned, was the warmest, most wonderful place in the world. We had it made. We had everything we ever could have wanted until folks started to get sick. And like so many Americans, healthcare costs ended up changing our lives and the trajectory of my career and desire. And they're great. I love my mom to death. I miss my grandfather dearly.
NICU nurses see a lot and they work on their feet nonstop, 12-hour shifts, 3-4 days a week. What did you learn from watching your mom in terms of your future shaping of public service?
I'll say what I learned from that. I'll also just say one of the ways I feel incredibly lucky. I learned the value of hard work. My mother managed to work those shifts that you talked about and help manage others, and then also come home and make sure I had done my homework, or call my grandparents to make sure that the things had gotten done. She still was around to cook Sunday dinner after taking us to church. I just learned the value of faith and hard work and family from her. I'll say I feel really lucky. I have a mom who, yes, I love as my mother, and who is always there for a kind word or a kick in the butt. But I also call my mother even now when I have management issues. My mother was a professional manager for years and helped build a new unit at Rush University Hospital downtown. And so she's somebody I just respect and love so much as a professional, in addition to being my mom. And I feel really, really lucky to have her as a resource in addition to an anchor.
You touched on healthcare earlier, and your family had no shortage of health issues. Your grandfather had congestive heart failure, your grandmother had Alzheimer's, your mom battled breast cancer. How did those experiences impact your perspective on responsibility for your own personal journey?
Thanks for the question. It turned our lives upside down. I mean, I mentioned never feeling like we lacked for anything, or that there couldn't have been a luckier kid in the world. And then all of a sudden, I had 2 very sick grandparents and a mom who was fighting breast cancer and had a drainage tube coming out of her side. And it was really hard to see for me. I did what I could to try to help. I got a job. I worked at the UPS store up the street from my house and drove my grandparents to and from medical appointments and tried to be helpful at home and tried to aid my mom. But I think it gave me a really valuable perspective. And it's all the things that we talk about in politics about what families go through, I saw and I experienced, and understand what it's like to feel helpless and to watch a grandpa and a grandma who were incredibly prideful and really good savers, and folks who had worked their entire lives and struggle to pay their healthcare bills and deal with the stress of all of that. And so it made me want to make the world a better place and make sure that my family's struggles would not be as widely spread. But it also just taught me an empathy for folks who go through that because I experienced it myself.
Back up a little bit. Since you were raised with public service in the blood and that's what you were taught at home, most people start with a journey of a paper route or working or volunteering in a shelter. Did you have a trajectory of public service from your childhood on?
My first job was working at the UPS store. And I've got to tell you, Elizabeth, just with how much was going on in the home, that really kind of had to be my focus. I mean, mom was still working incredibly hard, was still managing a large unit. I had to get my grandparents to and from the hospital, to and from other appointments. I had to make sure they had the care they needed at home because when you have aging parents, grandparents, my grandfather used to say, once a man, twice a child. And I really got to see that from them. And so really I had to focus on trying to keep up my own academics and then be, the emotional and physical support that my family needed. That sort of public service outside of volunteering occasionally with our church really were in college and then getting into my career.
I'm glad you brought up college since you earned a BA in public policy from the University of Chicago. Did you know that only 6% of people who apply to the University of Chicago public policy actually get accepted? What led from that bachelor's degree into you wanting to run for the Illinois House of Representatives?
I got really lucky. I did a talk last week at one of my alma maters, Loyola Law School, and I was asked, what's the most important thing to be successful? And my answer was finding the right mentors and finding the right friends. And that's what really happened to me at University of Chicago. One of my professors, John Eason, who was also a resident, had been a community organizer, had worked in politics on Obama for Congress in 2000. He and I had a lot in common, both had difficult upbringings. And really in him, I saw someone who I wanted to, in some ways, pattern my life after. He was getting his PhD in public policy studies. And he basically said to me, hey, congratulations. You're now at the University of Chicago. To your point, Elizabeth, you've made it to this elite institution. But what about those other kids in Maywood and Westchester who could be where you were by your own admission if they had the same opportunities that you did? What are you going to do about that? And really it was John and then his introduction of me to his friend Will Burns, who was my predecessor in the state rep seat that I would eventually hold, was really what got me into public service. And originally I was a community organizer for 2.5 years, which we can talk more about. And my view is that the system needed to be kind of pulled apart and in some ways started over. And when I saw Will doing what he did as state rep and then as alderman after I ran this campaign, and got to see our then Attorney General Lisa Madigan and Fourth Ward Alderman Tony Preckwinkle becoming County Board President, I saw that there actually are ways that good elected officials can have a really important impact on people. And I started to think that maybe that would be something that I could do. And because before that, other than seeing Barack Obama speak in 2004 and saying, okay, well, that guy seems really special and that's interesting, I wasn't necessarily focused on going into politics.
In your 6 years in the House, who would you say took you under their wing the most? And what piece of legislation would you say you're most proud of in that time?
I had a lot of people that I looked up to in the House. I will tell you, she comes to mind because unfortunately we just lost her. Barbara Flynn Curry, who was the House Majority Leader for many years from Hyde Park, and I became very, very close during the Rauner impasse years when we had session all year round. I ended up driving her back and forth to Springfield. I mean, I could talk about the legislative part, but if you'll indulge me for a second, I mean, in some ways she helped reignite my love of history. She was a huge history buff. We did all of Churchill's memoirs together. She got me Barbara Tuchman's The Guns of August, because in everything she did, she was very focused on the role of women in history and the excellence of women, everything from legislative stuff to books to business. And she's smart as a whip. She's one of the smartest people I've ever met, one of the best legislators. And her command of the issues, the way she studied bills, the way she mastered the committee structure, she was just really important to me. Will, who I mentioned was my mentor, he gave me so much good advice going in. And then I was fortunate to sit next to Mike Zaleski, who was chairman of the Revenue Committee for many, many years and just a brilliant legislator. And so I learned a lot from observing those folks. And LG Sims, who's now over in the Senate, was an appropriator, worked with Will on Senate staff, just really brilliant on budget stuff. So I was lucky to have a lot of really, really smart people that I got to work with and get to know.
Just to follow up on the second part of that question, I really want to hear what you personally thought was your most successful legislation. Also, a second part of that, would you say that legislation was easier to get through than you thought because of a supermajority or because Illinois is a blue state? Was it a more positive experience than it probably is for a lot of other blue legislators in red states?
Education funding reform is without question the thing I'm most proud of, evidence-based funding. I was a chief co-sponsor of the bill. Will Davis led it in the House, and then my friend Andy Manar, who's now deputy governor, led it in the Senate. To answer your question about the ease of legislation, I can't remember who said, I'm not the member of any organized party, I'm a Democrat. I think that applies to working within a supermajority, which is to say Democrats are a wide spectrum. It's the thing I'm most proud of our party is it really is a Big Ten. You have very conservative, more blue dog Republicans. At the time, believe it or not, we had Democrats from Southern Illinois. My friend Jerry Costello, who's now running the Department of Agriculture, who was also a dear friend and mentor. And you had folks from that all the way up to my really dear friend in Rogers Park, Kelly Cassidy, who's very, very liberal. And so you're figuring out the right way to deal not just with these different personalities, but the different geographies they represent, and figuring out how to do a big school funding bill that addresses the needs of, yes, the city of Chicago, but also downstate districts that are poor and need help. But then also folks all the way up as far north as New Trier, who, yes, may have more property wealth, but also have their own interests in making sure that they maintain their own excellence. And so I really had to learn to listen to folks, to integrate various opinions and perspectives. And I think that that time in the House is difficult and sometimes frustrating, Elizabeth, as it was. was what prepared me to then lead big legislative initiatives as deputy governor. So everything happens for a reason. I didn't realize at the time. I was often frustrated and didn't understand, hey, we've got this bill. It's a good idea. Why isn't it happening? But learning that patience and that process, I think, prepared me for what was coming next.
Out of curiosity, under the big tent that you just mentioned, if somebody wanted a synopsis, can you give me where you feel that you personally land on the spectrum of Democrats?
I think I'd answer that by saying Christian is somebody who believes that every voice is worth listening to, even if he doesn't agree. And I really do mean that. When I look at some of the big things that I was able to accomplish, even under the leadership of the governor and the governor's office, things like the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act, it really is something I'm proud of as somebody who considers himself to be, a fairly progressive Democrat, but it included principles that were helpful to some of our legacy fossil fuel plants downstate and that accommodated some of the interests that I may not necessarily have agreed with always ideologically, but that were incredibly important and that were worthy of having a spot at the table. So I think I would say I'm a person who believes very deeply in public service, what it means that it's the biggest enterprise we invest in together. And when we give up on it, we give up on ourselves. Who believes that life should be just a little bit easier for working families like mine and that a healthcare crisis should not make you go bankrupt, who believes that we can both have energy that is clean and affordable and breathe clean air, but also make sure that the light switch is going to come on when we flick it. So somebody who believes things very deeply, but is very flexible on figuring out the way to get there that is going to be durable in the long term. So long answer to a short question, but that's kind of how I describe myself.
Would you say that's why Governor J.B. Pritzker chose you as his running mate for those very values?
I like to think so. And I think that one thing that I really like about being JB's partner is that we really do think about the state in the same way. We have a fundamental set of values about making sure that working people can afford to get ahead, about making sure that healthcare is affordable, that energy is affordable and accessible. But we also really do listen to folks. We go all the way back to 2019 because I know this era has become so partisan. When I was coming in as deputy governor, JB said, "Hey, listen, when we get down to Springfield, we do inauguration. I'm obviously going to go to the receptions for the Democratic leaders, but I want to make sure I also go by and see Bill Brady and Jim Durkin, who were the leaders at the time. And I want to go to their receptions." And I was with him. We went to see the House and Senate GOP. And what he said is, "Listen, I believe that if you come to me with good ideas, you're going to be met with an open hand. Now, where you try to take away rights from people or whatever it is, you'll be met with a strong sense of determination. But I think that openness is something that we share. We have a set of values that we care about. But if you come to the table with goodwill and you've got an idea, we can get stuff done." Our first budget was bipartisan. The Capitol bill was bipartisan. I know it seems like life on Mars now, given how Trump has driven partisanship in this country, but that's really what we believe. And I think we share that belief together.
I want to talk about your history a little more. So let's start with Soul. Right out of college, you were boots on the ground for Soul. Can you talk a little bit about that organization?
So Southsiders Organized for Unity and Liberation, it's still around. I think, their first organizer. It was the best education, Elizabeth, that I could have received. I tell people that when you're a community organizer, if you think of it in almost as a political campaign, you are communications, you are field, you are fundraising, you are all of it. And there were times when you have to fundraise your own salaries. It taught me a lot that later applied to my life, but most importantly, the one-on-one conversations, those one-on-one relationships, going door to door, house to house, meeting in church basements. Part of what it did for me, it taught me that my story, that what I grew up with what I saw, the ways in which my life changed in an instant, that was unfortunately very common. And it gave me a sense of how important it was to work together in community. It also made me feel not so alone. And that there was a part of me, I think, that was saying, well, I had some shame around what had happened to us. And maybe if I had worked harder, or if others had worked harder, then maybe it wouldn't have happened. No, this is a systemic problem. Too many Americans, too many who look like me, but also many who don't and live in downstate farming communities, they all have these same challenges. And so it was the best education I think that I received. I learned a ton. I met people who would be important to me in my career. But I also think that what it did for me is it gave me almost a filter. Whenever I'm doing something legislatively or from the executive branch, I'm thinking, what's the impact going to be on the ground? How do we involve stakeholders who are closer to the grassroots in making the policy and thinking about how it's going to be administered? When I think about CEJA, for example, and the clean workforce hubs, that was in part community groups that were saying, hey, we're happy to work through more traditional routes like community colleges, but we need something closer to the ground. And I had those contacts because of that work that I did a full decade before that.
Organizing is one thing, but actually knowing the nuances of the law, that's a whole other issue. You went back to school and got a JD from Loyola. Can you tell me how knowing the loopholes and the ins and outs of the law have helped your constituents as a state rep and has really strengthened your knowledge of Illinois law?
Yeah, law school was always a dream of mine, and I really do want to give a little bit of love here to Loyola in Chicago and the former dean of that school, Michael Kaufman, who's now at Santa Clara. He created a weekend JD program, and in some ways, I would argue what he did was democratize law school. When I was in law school, I was in law school with the now Adjutant General of the Alaska National Guard, with a working mom who I think was on her fourth child at that point, with a person who lived in North Carolina. And none of these folks, like me, could have ever gone to law school in a traditional program. And Loyola made it possible. And I'd argue the legal profession is better for it. For me, I'd seen lawyers throughout my life fight for justice and was inspired by them. Love Thurgood Marshall. I have a picture of him in my home office. But I also, being in the legislature, understanding how to read legislation, how to think about, okay, well, if we do a rulemaking, what's going to be the impact of that? How will this affect the Administrative Procedures Act? Those things all may seem small, but for example, when we were putting together cannabis, which was one of my projects, thinking about the constitutionality of trying to create social equity and to do so in a way that helped eliminate and address past discrimination, but also was going to hold up to constitutional scrutiny. I was in constitutional law at Loyola at that time. And so I was directly applying my legal education, and knock on wood, so far that has held up to legal challenges. And so it definitely enhanced my ability to do my job. I wouldn't say it's essential for everybody, but I learned a lot and I'm really glad I did it.
You said you had always wanted to go to law school. Had you always wanted to also join the Illinois Air National Guard? Was that always something that was on your horizon?
I'll take you further than that, Elizabeth. I actually wanted to be an F-16 pilot. When I was young and in high school, very young picture of me wearing an F-14 Tomcat sweatshirt, and my mother loved Top Gun. So I always wanted to fly planes. My grandfather served. He was a sergeant in the Army during Korea. Turned out you could not serve unless you had perfect vision at the time. Now it can be LASIKed, but at the time it was perfect vision. So it was always in my blood. And then what happened is I'm in the governor's office. The Illinois National Guard, the Department of Military Affairs, rolled up to me when I was deputy governor. I got very close to the then Adjutant General, General Neely, as well as then Colonel Marty Green, who still runs the Illinois CPA Society. And I was leaving the office, and I'd worked with them on COVID and the response that we had in getting shots in arms. I had worked with them on disaster relief. I'd worked with them in protecting life and property and the right to protest after the murder of George Floyd. And it was this extraordinary organization of men and women in the Air National Guard who were doing incredible work for us. And I kind of said, hey, how can I help? And my guys pulled me aside. They're like, hey, now you just got your law degree. Yeah. And you got some free time. I was like, sure. It's like, well, why don't you apply? So I applied and I assessed, did officer training school in 2024 and then judge advocate school in 2025. And I go down once a month to Peoria for the Peoria Air National Guard Wing. And it's just a joy. And it really is a reminder of the big things we can do together, regardless of partisanship and region. And it's an honor to serve. I wish my grandfather had lived to see it.
From Seoul to Loyola Law to the Illinois Air National Guard, which of these roles or all of them prepared you the most to be lieutenant governor?
It's a good question. I would say it's a summation. I believe in a God who has perfect timing. And I can't remember where I saw it. I can't remember if it's a phrase, a poem, something. I'm just going to say it. Everything you're going through is preparing you for what you asked for. I don't remember who said it, somebody profound, I'm sure. But I really do believe that. And I think about all of the difficulties or frustrations or times when things were moving slower. I think about the legislative process being as slow as it is and coming in at 26 and being sometimes frustrated by it. But that patience now was incredibly valuable in leading large legislative initiatives in the governor's office as deputy governor. I think about how cynical these times feel and how much it can look up and say, God, this country's fractured. It's never coming back together. And then I go to the National Guard and I see people, many of whom I'm quite sure are not voting for me. I don't care. And they don't either. We have a job to do and we do it together. And oh, by the way, over time, who knows? Just from knowing me personally, some may in fact come over. And I think that it's all of those experiences tied together. It's being an organizer and a legislator myself and a deputy governor and somebody who's a member of the military, and just all those perspectives combined, I think really helped to get me both to being the place of being ready for this next role, but also just being the person that I am. And I'm really appreciative of all of them.
Often politicians get into one role and then either internal pressure or external pressure, they look for a higher office or a different role. Juliana Stratton is going to be the next U.S. Senator from Illinois. Governor J.B. Pritzker may step aside and want you to be the next governor. Have you thought past your current role as the candidate for lieutenant governor?
It's the classic politician answer, but I really am living in the moment. Actually, I was on a road trip in 2014. We were going around the state to work on the fair tax. It was myself and now Senate President Don Harmon. I don't remember where we were, but we were listening to Take It Easy by the Eagles. And I think often of a lyric from that song, which is, we may lose and we may win, but we will never be here again. And to me, it's about the value of being present. So for me, we talked earlier about mentors, and my mentor, Will Burns, always said, Mitchell, when you do the job that you have in front of you well, the future will take care of itself. That has always, Elizabeth, been my experience in every role that we've talked about that I've done. So I'm going to focus on doing this job the best I can, being the second Black lieutenant governor we've ever had, following the footsteps of Juliana, who is going to be our next US Senator. I want to keep my head down, focus on economic development, focus on our healthcare, focus on the future of our workforce, focus on helping this governor continue to move Illinois forward. And I think if I do that, the future will take care of itself.
You read my mind. I was dovetailing into that question, and I'm going to let you go in a couple of minutes. But climate change, economic challenges, healthcare, where do you even begin? What will be your primary focus when you get in office?
I'm going to zoom out for a second, then I'll zoom in on those issues. And the zoom out is right now on the campaign, I'm focused on going everywhere I possibly can. I was apparently the first new statewide candidate to come to Crawford County since 2002. I don't know if I'll pull off the full Grassley of getting to all 102, but I'm going to attempt to get to as many as I can, because I think the biggest thing you can do for people is show up. And I think showing up brings trust and brings credibility. And when you have trust and credibility as a public servant, that's what gives you the currency to lead. So that's my priority one. I'd say priority two, getting underneath the hood of that, really concerned about economic development. I've got vacancies on State Street in Chicago. We've got vacancies in Jerseyville, and we've got vacancies in Belleville, and figuring out what the future of economic development is across the state. What's the Illinois 2050 plan? What are the sectors we need to invest in? And how do we make sure that not everyone, from our big, large businesses to our small businesses to our farmers, have what they need, that the state's doing what it can to create the infrastructure for success. Right, we've got 60 billion in agriculture we do right now. People think about Illinois, they think about Chicago, and they think about other things like that. They don't think about the fact that we are the number one producer of soybeans in the country, that we're a huge producer of corn and pumpkins. And so making sure that our farmers have what they need, hugely important. I care deeply about healthcare. My mom, as you know, was a nurse for 40 years. We've got 9 rural hospitals at risk of closure because of the willful cuts in HR 1 to Medicaid by the Trump administration. That's going to affect a whole bunch of people. So figuring out what is the future of healthcare, because as you also may know, like back in the day, my grandfather being a steel worker was a huge deal. That was the route of the middle class. Now being a nurse is. Now being in healthcare is. And so how do we prepare our community colleges, our high schools, even our elementary schools, to get kids ready for those jobs? And as we go into AI and biotech, life science, quantum, agricultural science, how do we get our folks ready to benefit from those booms? So I really want to focus on the future and also making sure that the cost of living in Illinois comes down for people right now. Those are going to be my big focuses.
I'm glad you mentioned Chicago versus Belleville. People south of I-80 get frustrated that Cook County and Chicago gets a lot of the attention. You said you want to try to get to all 102 counties. You know about the agriculture, soybeans, pumpkins. We're the number one pumpkin distributor. Is this something that you feel will resonate with people south of I-80, that you need to reiterate this message that you are the lieutenant governor for the entire state?
Yeah, I also, and I'm really not just saying it, I believe showing up. I think it's very hard to caricature people who you have laid your eyes on physically. And I think in this era of deep fakes and AI and social media, that being physically present with people really matters. And so I really want to do that. And I think that I want to make clear, and the governor is this way as well, we're going to take on anybody who comes for the people of the state of Illinois. Democrat, Republican, if you are doing something to hurt the people of Illinois, we're going to stand up for you. I think, one example of this, and I've been saying this often on the campaign trail, we've got a guy running against us in Darren Bailey, who ostensibly is a farmer. This president and his war of choice in the Middle East has driven up the cost of fertilizer. All of the inflation driven by terrible economic decisions and by tariffs is raising the cost of their inputs and lowering the value of their outputs, while he's bailing out Argentina with $20 billion. That doesn't make any sense. And in theory, if you're going to stand up for the people of Illinois, you're definitely going to stand up in the profession that you claim to hold and represent. It's an example of what leadership looks like and what it doesn't. We would be calling that out, are calling that out. And, we're running against people who won't. So I think that demonstrating by your presence and by your positions that you're on the side of people, regardless of where they live, I think that's going to hunt and do well for us in this election.
You do know that we could do an entire podcast separately on why people vote against their best interests, right?
Yeah, oh, absolutely. 100%. But I will say, I really do think the trust deficit, Elizabeth, is real. And I think that some of that is showing up for people. We'll find out if I'm right about that. But my intention is to make sure that nobody's going to be able to say, never really seen Mitchell and Pritzker. We're not doing that. They may disagree. We may have other issues, but we're going to show up. And I think maybe some of that trust opens the way, creates a permission structure to talk about issues. And maybe if we can talk about issues in a fulsome way and who's on your side and who's not, maybe people start to come home. Call me a sunny-eyed optimist, but that's where my head's at.
Two questions before I let you go. The first one, personally, what do you like to do in your very limited downtime? Are you a sports guy? Are you a chef? What do you like to do?
It's like you read my mind. You got to two of my three top hobbies. So my grandfather was a boxer in the Army, and he taught me a bit as a teenager. So I still box once or twice a week. I am not a very good Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu player. I do that once a week. I'm hoping to get that up to 2 or 3 times. So I love combat sports. Really excited Cinco de Mayo weekend. We have 2 amazing championship fights coming up that I will be watching after guard duty. So love sports. I love to cook. My mom was I'd say, more traditional recipe cook. My grandfather and grandmother more the improvisers, but I got to watch them both. So I love to cook. I have not cooked in 3.5 weeks, which is one way to tell how busy I am because it's how I relax. And then I'm a huge, huge, huge reader. Love sci-fi, love history. Currently going through a massive deep dive on the life of Ulysses S. Grant, who is, I think, the most underrated Illinois president. So I love history. I love reading, and also a big gamer. I also have not played video games in like a month because I'm busy going across the state. So that's how I like to relax.
Can you give me an image? Like, are you Minecraft guy, Grand Theft Auto, somewhere in between?
I'm a role playing guy. So I grew up on, none of these necessarily mean much to you, maybe, or maybe not, but things like Baldur's Gate, Mass Effect is probably my favorite. It's a sci fi RPG, think like Star Wars, but a bit more operatic. But then I grew up on Zelda and Mario Kart and Kirby and all. So I still have my functional Super Nintendo, still works. Still have my first Game Boy, still works. I have a wide range of video game interests.
If somebody wants to get involved with your campaign, whether it's knocking on doors, postcarding, calls, whatever, what's the best way to get in touch with your team?
One quick way, C Mitchell for LG on Instagram. So give us a follow, and that's one good way to keep up with me and what we're doing. And if you reach out there, we can get you involved in any other way you'd like to be. Whether it's me or the governor or the Democratic Party, please get involved. It is genuinely the most important election of our lifetimes. And if we don't have this one, we may not have another. So hope that your listeners will all come out and get involved. And obviously grateful to you, Elizabeth, for all that you do and all the ways that you inspire people. So happy to do this and always happy to come back.
Thank you for joining us for the Indivisible Illinois podcast series. Christian Mitchell, I really appreciate your time today. Thank you.
My pleasure. Take care.